Nuts about nuts? Well, on today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, we're going to talk about nuts, why when you're nuts about nuts, it actually has something to do with a nut of sorts, and we'll ask the cards for some advice about work and life that's not so nuts. I'm John Paulus. You're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet, only on YouTube. If you're enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe if you haven't already. If you have, thank you. And if you have a Brave browser, you could now contribute basic attention tokens to Life's Potluck Buffet with John Paulus through your Brave browser. And thank you for your support. And thank you for listening. Where should I begin today? Why don't we start with the idea that you see a lot in advertisements and marketing for nuts, and that's, things like nuts are brain food. On Life's Potluck Buffet, we take that pretty literally because the word for let's get back to the beginning. Do you remember on yesterday's episode when I was talking about how there are these language families that existed in what is now today called Europe that were there as indigenous languages when the people who spoke the Indo-European languages that came from not places that were not in Europe, settled in those areas that are places that are now what we call Europe, and brought with them their language families or family, and that that there were already existing languages there. And the only one that is still widely spoken today is the Basque language, which was the language of people in what we would call the Iberian Peninsula, where like Spain and Portugal are, but the Spain and France border areas and into Spain, that area. And I got to tell you, this is not a spoiler alert, but keep your ears open for a mention of a group that is a Celtic language speaking group. So therefore, from that Indo-European family of languages that settled with the people who settled there later on. Well, that group's going to also be important. But let's get back to the language that was spoken in the Aegean and western parts of Asia Minor before the Indo-European language-speaking people settled in that area, speaking the language that would become, what we call Greek. The language that was already there had a word for a tree that produced a fruit that had a nut in it that we call in English an almond. And the word in that language was something like amygdala, and the Greek language borrowed that word. So that word was was in that area of the Aegean before the Indo-European languages were active there, and that word amygdala became the word for almond in all what are now European languages. All of those languages use a word that's from amygdala or one of its later forms for their word for almond. And so what does this tell us? Well, this tells us that there were almond trees in the Aegean and western parts of Asia Minor, somewhere around there, because some of those languages might have been related to a family that people sometimes label Aegean Asian family of languages that were indigenous to those areas before the speakers of the Indo-European and other language families came into those areas. And so that means that we already have a word that is from the area that they're already using to call that, and then all of a sudden all of these other languages borrow it. So it sounds like that's a good sign that the almond was being grown in those areas very early on. And many centuries later, or millennia later, a person in Germany named Carl Friedrich Burdach, who in some accounts is really the person who started calling biology biology. Well, Carl Friedrich Burdach also labeled something about the human anatomy in the brain based on what it looked like. He called it the amygdala because it looked like, to him, the almond nut. And so the amygdala, and there are two, there is a left and a right amygdala, and these do things like they are places where emotions and the kind of emotional reward and also anxiety systems that humans have are. So it's kind of interesting because when you say that you're nuts about something, and that comes from a word being like really like pleased about something, and then eventually became excited about something, and eventually became like really crazy about something. When you say, and then it became the word crazy, when we say someone or something is nuts, meaning it's crazy. That emotional response, I don't know. Ironically, I don't think it's ironic. It's just awesome that that emotional response comes from the almonds that you have in your brain. So, in a sense, when you're nuts about nuts, it's because your brain almonds really trigger a reward system that emotionally makes you happy to be having almonds. So think about that next time you have almonds. If you like almonds, it's your amygdala that makes you say, "Oh, I can't wait to eat these almonds. I'm nuts about almonds." It's actually maybe the amygdala there, the almonds in your brain that are actually making you say that. So being nuts about nuts is because of the almonds in your brain. That's kind of cool. Burdock could have equally called these. Looking at them, I think he could equally have called them the walnuts, or in this case. And this is why I wanted to. This is where we bring in that group that is near. Remember, I was talking about there's a group in this case, it's in the kind of southern western part of what is today France, and but in ancient times, a long time ago, there was a group there that were called the Wolkai. Remember, I was talking about people near where the Basque language is spoken. That was going to be important later on. Well, this is it. This is later on now, and so the Wolkai were a group that spoke a Celtic language, and they are the place that they were in France, north of Toulouse, is very close, if not overlapping, with the largest walnut producing center of France today, which is the Dordogne. And because of the massive amount of walnuts that were being grown there and in other parts of what was called in ancient times by outsiders Gaul, especially the Romans called it this, and the nuts that were grown there in such plentiful quantities were called by Alemannic groups. And if you know French or other languages where the word Alaman has to do with German, what we would call German in English, those groups speaking their Germanic languages called these nuts walnuts. They called them walnuts, and the wall part of walnuts is from a Germanic root that has to do with stranger or foreigner or strange, coming from some other group. And you can see that connects with the fact that these were coming from groups that were to the German language speakers an import, so to speak. So that's where the Germanic languages get the word walnut, and it's same is true in English. And in fact, the English, the root, the old Germanic root for the wall part of walnut is also present in the English language in the well part of Welsh, because that Welsh word, the well part, is also related to this word for talking about an outside group from the Beacer Celtic language speakers, our Celtic language speakers. The endonym, the name that people call themselves for the Welsh, is Cymru, which means something like. Normally, these endonyms usually have to do with basically the word for people who the fellow people that are from the same. There are the same people, so usually it has to do with that around the world. It's very common that people, groups of people, call themselves, well, we're people, right? In our language, because that's what we, that's us, that's our group, and so. Cymru means something like fellow country people. So the opposite of what Welsh means to Germanic language speakers, which means the people who aren't fellow country, the strangers or foreigners or external people that aren't us speaking our language, doing our thing, having our ways. Because the groups like the Wolkai probably just called walnuts nuts, and they didn't need a name like foreign nuts, walnuts, because these are the nuts that we have here that we grow. So, all right, let's ask the cards about what we can be nuts about in our work in life, and hope the advice is not nuts. No, cards, I know the advice is not. I'm sorry. I was just doing that for the sake of the pun. Okay. Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles, cards. Tell us some things. All right. And here we go. Oh, wow. It's a wild card. It's the wild card that says, say what you would like to have in this bowl. There's a picture of a bowl in it. It can be anything. Now say why you chose what you did and who or what can make it appear. Well, since we're talking about nuts, a bowl of walnuts or almonds or pecans or any nuts would be great right now. And so I'll go and pour that out, and I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet. You think about what you would put in that bowl, because it can be anything. It doesn't need to be just a food product. And then think about who or what can make that appear, or talk to somebody about it. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow.